He held up his glass in a toast. He hailed doom, hailed the desire for death, the zing-zee key. The carousel music surged and roared, but inside his heart, dread lurked. The heart did not want to die. The heart hated death.
Hey, this is Nathan.
Hey, this is Nick, and today you're listening to the B.O.S. podcast, where we're talking about Hermann Hesse's short Klingsor's Last Summer.
So before we get started, just wanted to note that we have a new recording setup here. Nick and I are in Nick's house in San Francisco recording face-to-face, and you may notice that David is also not joining us today, but he will be back next time when we talk about Hesse's Glass Bead game.
Right, so this entire thing is kind of a brand new structure. We also just pounded a ton of coffee, and we're kind of like jittery and nervous, and we have a lot of eye contact. So if you can sense that eye contact, that's exactly what's going on. So back to actually, the books of subsubstance topics. So Hermann Hesse's Klingsor's Last Summer, which is sort of a short written in 1919, when Hermann Hesse himself was 42. And so we have a character of Klingsor, who's a 42-year-old artist, who's basically somewhat self-destructive, very passionate, a man of romance. And so basically we're trying to figure out how much of this is a thinly veiled portrait of Hesse himself. Is it just a commentary on art? Is he maybe even poking fun at artists in general? I don't know. What do you think, Nathan?
Well, let's provide a little context just about who Hesse was, and sort of the figure that he is in literature at the time, and why we're reading him today. So he was a major German writer, came out of sort of a romantic period in the early 20th century and wrote largely between the periods of World War I and World War II. He was German, but did most of his writing in Switzerland, and wrote a lot of works on sort of this transitioning, the contrast of the logical man and the emotional man, how one lives an inner spiritual life in a modern world, and these sorts of things. So what was your question?
Why are we reading Hesse? Well, how's it fit in with Klingsor? Is Klingsor Hesse? Is Klingsor not Hesse?
I mean, I have a hard time. I'm a fan of Hesse. I've been a fan of Hesse for a while.
Huge fan.
I mean, you might say huge fan, but I haven't read Narcissus and Goldmund, which is apparently...
That's the jam.
For a lot of people, that's his book, and I haven't read that one.
That's the one.
I read Steppenwolf in my last year of college, and I always tell people that it was, if there's a book that changed my life and changed the direction that I was going, it was Steppenwolf.
Have you seen Steppenwolf, the band?
No.
I've seen Steppenwolf, the band. I've seen Steppenwolf. I've seen the main guy from Steppenwolf with like 6 other people. So it's somebody as Steppenwolf. So not.
But they were playing Steppenwolf songs.
Yeah, they might all be dead or OD'd.
They were like a hair metal band, right?
They did the Magic Carpet Ride song.
Can you?
That's not what it sounds like at all. You would know this anyway.
I think I've probably heard. I grew up listening to like classic rock because that was the only radio station.
This has been in like every car commercial for like 2 decades.
Did you know there was a Steppenwolf movie?
No.
Starring what's his name? He's the Swedish
Keanu Reeves?
No. Really tall guy who's also in Star Wars recently.
I have no idea.
Anyway, it looks super weird.
Like it's a new thing?
No, it was like made in the 70s.
Oh, okay.
And they had 4 directors or something who all dropped out, and then the thing ended up being just a psychedelic mess.
How that would be tied to it. But anyway, so Nathan, Steppenwolf fan.
So, all that to say, I always have a hard time differentiating Hesse from his protagonists and his antagonists, because I always feel like he places people in conflict with each other, usually to represent this dual human nature that he seems to be wrestling with, in order to explore these philosophies. What's the place of logic? What's the value of emotion? How do you live life with this conflict? And he seems to replay this conflict in different scenarios. And in this one specifically, like you noted, it seems to be almost directly autobiographical in that the protagonist is 42 years old, living in Italy.
Somewhere in the South.
Hesse wrote it when he was 42 years old, having just moved to the South, either to Italy or Italian-speaking Switzerland.
After his family, I believe it sort of fell apart. His wife had schizophrenia. I think they split up and maybe the kids went to somewhere. I don't know. I don't think Hesse was actually that stand-up of a gentleman himself.
Well, it depends on how you define that, because I think he also wrestles with what it means to be, a good person in his works. And in Klingsor's Last Summer, he talks about his relationship to his mistress, Gina. And Klingsor is saying, I don't know if I can love. I can look for myself in someone else. I can look for a mirror in someone else. I can be passionate towards somebody else. And all that can resemble love, but is that love? So I feel like he kind of wrestles with his role and with, is it more important to be an artist and follow one's inner passions and inner drive, or is it more important to play some sort of expected role in society?
Right. Yeah, he's the self-discovery guy, which kind of leads in the question of why are we still reading so much Hesse, right? Or are we reading so much Hesse? Where is it just the 60s and then we're just obsessed with the 60s and the 60s we're obsessed with Hesse?
That's a good question. I ask myself this a lot because Hesse is so important to me personally. And it makes me wonder if, is my way of looking at the world just that much out of time? Or is something about Hesse universal in that it still speaks to people? Because I think we're in a swing towards sort of social responsibility, and it's selfish to think of yourself as an individual, and that your own individual passions and drives are more significant than the role that you play in society. At least maybe in more liberal leaning circles. And Hesse is very much the opposite.
Right. He was very much the individual guy. And if you kind of like follow his arc of books that he started out with, they were all sort of his early romantic period was a lot of sort of basic wrestling with that. And then he shifted into sort of a later stage of Eastern influence, getting into the whole Siddhartha stuff. We'll eventually, in our next podcast, be talking about the Glass Bead Game, which is kind of his philosophical tract of all of this and the intellectual life of the mind and sort of his pursuits there. And then sandwiched in between those is Narcissus and Goldman, which is the battle between scholarship and, the life of the body, being sensual, pursuing the arts and things like that. So his whole career, he sort of wrestled with that. And that's kind of why, getting back to Klingsor, one of the reasons why I think it's such a relevant point, although maybe not Hesse's best. I think it's probably just somewhere in the middle, honestly. But it's just a window in sort of an inflection point in Hesse's life where the earlier novels were really just about self-discovery and very independent, and then they got a lot more conceptual about how relationship with art and relationship with the intellect and things like that. And I view Klingsor's Last Summer as him also just sort of maybe even destroying himself or his old self. And so you have a character of Klingsor who he's a libertine, he's a hard drinker, he has tons of kind of friends varying from artistic to Eastern religion, and he is basically burning his candle at both ends, and even directly admits that in a passage. And he creates his last masterpiece before his kind of somewhat early death. So I feel just like that Hesse is sort of acknowledging that this pure artistic thing has a lifetime with it, and that eventually you're going to destroy yourself. And he had to sort of destroy himself to move beyond that.
So do you see... so just to give a little context, the book literally is about this artist, Klingsor's final summer before he dies. And his actual death doesn't really play into the book at all, other than that he knows that he's going to die. So what does he do with his final time on Earth? And I'm curious if you saw, or what you made of his death and the role of his death in the story, either literally or figuratively.
I think it was actually sort of an afterthought, the way it was written. It was sort of mentioned in the preface, and then so much of this is just around sort of the just the sensual elements of his last summer, which is just his socialization with his friends and group of artist community, his mistresses, also very, very in-depth descriptions of painting and colors and what it means to sort of create a version of something that may potentially be more real than the thing it was itself. And so he combines all of that into his final masterwork, and it absolutely sort of just wrings everything out of him. It drains him mentally, physically, and all that. And then sort of at the end, there's just this short moment where he's finished it, and he basically gets a shower and a shave, and I think he goes to buy flowers and then goes to see his lady. So it's almost like death is removed of its importance because of how strong the appeal to art, that he's created this thing that he had inside of him all along, that his experiences and his view of things, like that's what it was. And I think there's a welcoming of death there.
So do you think that maybe a moral or lesson of the story is that once he can pull this great truth out of himself, which is his self-portrait, that his final painting is his self-portrait that loses all contact with, quote unquote reality, and expresses some greater ultimate truth, and that once he's done that, then he can simply die?
I think so.
And he doesn't have to fear, and he doesn't have to party. He's just...
Yeah, I think that's almost in a way of Hesse trying to convince himself of that. Because, just as an artist anyway, anybody, isn't your goal to somehow create a thing that lasts longer than you? Not necessarily I need to make this thing that makes me popular, but I need to make this thing.
It's like a fear of not existing.
Exactly right. It's a way of making some sort of indent in the massive machine of the world, and sort of your view and your output can be relevant to someone else.
But it's interesting because I think that sorry, we got to stop using the word interesting.
Dude, if it's interesting, just say it's interesting. It's fine. Own your vocab.
Everything's interesting. Because in the book, one of my favorite passages, or in the short story, one of my favorite passages was when he and his friend Luigi, who represents the opposite end of art, who's flamboyant, painting carousels and tents and circuses, and just wants to live a very hedonistic life and not pursue the deeper truths. And he and Luigi are sitting and talking about what the significance of art is in art history.
Yeah, so I can just read this passage. So I'll start off. So, "You have painted delightful and jolly things, Luigi," Klingsor said. "Things I'm fond of, flagpoles, clowns, circuses. But to me, the most precious of all is a spot on your picture of the carousel after dark. High up in the night, far above the violet tent, and far above all the lights is a cool, small flag. Pale pink, so beautiful, so cool, so lonely, so horribly lonely. It's like a poem by Li Po or Paul Verlaine. All the sorrow and all the resignation of the world is in that small, silly pink flag, and all good laughter at sorrow and resignation. Your life is justified for having painted that little flag. I count it as one of your major achievements, that flag."
I love that passage. That's not actually the passage I was thinking about. But I love that. That's so perfect.
See, I feel like that ties into Hesse trying to basically enunciate why it's important to create the thing that makes an impact on the world, but that you don't necessarily actually know what that thing is. Maybe your most trivial achievement, just a flag on a carousel, outweighs all of the other things. So there's sort of this conundrum as an artist as you make this thing and you want it to be accessible and you want it to have some level of impact, but maybe the thing that you think is the most trivial is the most important.
See, I read it slightly differently than that, in that I think that what Hesse is saying is even in our attempts to be abundantly joyful and frivolous, that this sort of greater truth, this ecstatic truth, to quote Werner Herzog, is embedded in there. And that even when Luigi is trying to paint exuberance, there's this spot of sadness that speaks directly to the soul.
Ooh, I like that. That's good.
And he didn't even know that he painted it.
Yeah. I'd also just like to take a side note that also joining us for the podcast is the B.O.S. Mascot, our dog Tates, and she's currently snoring right now. So that's purely intended. She's just in the mood because us talking is just, she's over it.
She loves Hesse.
She's
loves German
Dude,
romanticism.
his prose is a little dry. We get it. It's fine. It's conceptual.
But the passage that I was talking about, let me see if I can pull this up, was when he and Luigi are sitting and talking about, so Klingsor and Luigi are sitting, and Klingsor brings up that this statue of Goethe, and I actually don't remember who the other artist is. And he's appalled that these great artists have been immortalized in history, but the passion of their art's lost. And he says, imagine a professor 100 years from now preaching to his students. Klingsor, born in 1877, and his contemporary Louis, nicknamed the Glutton, innovators in painting, liberation from the naturalism of color. When we examine the pair of artists closely, we find three clearly distinguishable periods. I'd rather throw myself under a locomotive right here and now. And this idea that art can't exist in history. Yeah. Art has to exist and be relevant now.
I also sort of want to call his bullshit. I think that he's playing around with that a little bit as to what it means to be famous and sort of the burden of that, and how anything that you create is always going to be misconstrued later in time. There's a quote I'm going to pull from the Glass Bead game, but that I already love, which is just history's third dimension is fiction. And so I think Hesse is aware of that, and all of these things will be distorted and boiled down to something else. But I still think, as an artist, Hesse knew that there was some level of impact, that there was some level of, desire to create that wasn't entirely just based upon, expression and whatnot. It had some level of finality with it. Now, I think he's also terrified by that, because once that thing exists and you get decades or centuries later, basically we're exactly those people. So if Klingsor did or did not throw himself under the locomotive 100 years ago, as we're talking about him 100 years now, if Klingsor is Hesse, follow that track. But I think he's terrified by that, right?
But I think I agree with what you're saying, but I think there's a difference between sort of the scholarly approach to art and seeing things not as living but as artifacts. And I think that what we try to do in book club and with the podcast is see the works as living works, as relevant works. And if they're not relevant anymore, then, fuck them.
But they kind of always are.
Well, they kind of always are if you continue to look at them that way.
Yeah.
But I think what a lot of us experience in school, growing up in the way that we learn a lot of this stuff, is unfortunately divorced from its relevance. And we learn that this is the list of things that's important to know. That, these are the artists that are important to know. Absolutely. These are the authors that are important to know. And we're not allowed, or there's not a venue for us to personally relate to them. And I think most artists would be appalled at that idea.
Yeah. And that's actually an excellent point, because I'm always amazed when I read these of how modern they feel in just the interactions between characters and their habits and their emotions and things like that. So you have entire just sections of this short story that are really just party sections. Like I drew sort of the comparison to Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, which I always sort of refer to as the original party novel. But this is just dudes slamming a bunch of red wine and then going to sing songs in the woods. Right? It's kind of like Dharma Bums. Every era had its hard drinking, hard living, artist set. And there's also just a section of literature that kind of always follows that around. And yes, there is some commentary on this about how that's not capable of living indefinitely. But pulling it back into the whole looking at things too academically is I think a lot of this is just entertainment, right? In addition to Hesse battling with what it means to be an artist, he's providing a picture of just a hard living painter, right? And just trying to sterilize that down in an academic environment of why you need to live Hesse, or why you need to learn Hesse, when if you actually just look at sort of how he lived, which I think a lot of those details came back into this book. I think that he was kind of an interesting artist, dude, right? I think he did stuff that a lot of us identify with, whether it's, as sort of going through a midlife crisis and where that comes from, or, just traveling and experiencing different things and sort of giving into the senses and all of that. And I like how that is sort of an always relevant thing that shows up in a lot of this fiction that I feel has just sort of been removed whenever people talk about it.
Do you think, So at different periods in time, Hesse's works have been decried as sort of degenerate, I suppose.
I could see that.
And there's an aspect that he speaks the language of high society. He speaks the language of sort of logical scientific thinking, and he uses that language to lead himself and the viewer into sort of the darkest corners of our subconscious or cravings or instincts or whatever. And I think, that maybe that scares some people, that scares certain aspects of certain elements of society. Do you think that Hesse is dangerous?
Ooh, I like that. Kind of. I think anybody who encourages someone to look in deep within is dangerous. I think that, look at right now. We won't turn this into a whole political thing, but there's no direct introspection right now anywhere. Like that's not a popular medium. Or let me rephrase that. That's not an encouraged medium by all. And so Hesse, I think, in a lot of ways encouraged that before it was kind of an epidemic of not having it.
Yeah, and I kind of want to sit on this for a little while because this has been since I've been reading this and getting back into Hesse, and honestly, as soon as I started reading Hesse, I feel like it sent me deep into it sent me into my dark corners. It really did. It awoke a part of me that it did the first time that I read Steppenwolf that I think I'm afraid of. But I don't know. I don't.
If you need to tell us your dark secrets right now, we could do one. It doesn't have to be number one. Maybe third.
My third darkest secret.
Yeah. It's okay. We don't have to turn this into Dr. Phil.
Yeah. But my point is that at this point in time, I'm just curious what the relevance of Hesse is, because like you said, I think that the trend is away from introspection, deep introspection. It's very popular right now to demonize your opponents, to demonize the other side. And we're looking at Hesse, who wrote between World War I and World War II when the worst shit that went down in the 20th century was going down in his country. And his response to it, he did anti-war stuff, he did wrote anti-fascist tracts and stuff, but by and large his response to it was this deep introspection and examining his own darkness and really following that. So I'm curious, is that ever an effective response by art towards a dark period of society, or is it a retreat? And what's the relevance for today's reader to explore that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely relevant. And I would say, so sort of an addendum to your description about his role in sort of the extremely dark periods of European society in the 20th century, is that a lot of his sort of writer community was surprisingly getting pulled into sort of the individual nationalist fervor of their respective countries. And so Hesse, even though there is an element of retreat, and I think he did sign up for the army, but didn't make it through due to some medical reason or something. And so he had some level of impact. So I think he didn't entirely run away from the realities of the World War. But he sort of showed that part of the issue with the whole nationalist stuff is the lack of introspection. And there's a quote from Demian, which is actually probably one of my favorite books of his, if I'm even pronouncing it correctly, who knows. But it's basically, I tried to live in accordance with my true self, but why was that so very difficult? And I think that once you abandon yourself, there's kind of two ways of doing it. You abandon yourself for, your role as an important part of society, right? Or there's the opposite of you abandon yourself to the machine, where you're just accepting and will give up anything, whether it's in terms of liberty or artistic output or something for the good of, essentially the fascist machine. And so I think Hesse's way of fighting that was to be introspective for himself and use that as an example for people who may be starting to feel some of those dark corners themselves. And so I think that's a lot of why in the 60s he caught on so heavily in the U.S., outside of sort of the Carl Jung, like psychoanalytic stuff that he also really got into at some point. But a lot of it is just about examining yourself and like, how do you fit in when the things around you aren't really what you thought they would be or what maybe anyone intended them to be, and sort of putting that value back on the individual. And I think people can always argue that's selfish, but I think that a lot of times that's required for sort of the healthy tension of society in which we're productive, in which we're relevant contributors, right? You can't just forego the entire self. Otherwise, you end up with an entire country of selfless beings. And that's essentially what, nationalism is and what people had to deal with both in the mid part of, last century and hopefully will be being squashed in our early days here.
So self-reflection as anti-fascism.
That's my pitch. Did it work? Does that check out? I don't know. I've never really taken a history class. Brand new.
So maybe we should get back to literature.
Yeah, that would work.
I mean, God, it's so hard not to talk about politics.
Yeah. But, that's where he fit in, right? And I think a lot of his works were sort of banned at a censorship level because of these things. And so back to the question of, is he...
from both sides.
Yeah, exactly, right. So he spoke to people of the academic intellectual side. He spoke to people of, the counterculture side. I think he actually was dangerous because he was not afraid to examine this stuff. But I also think that a lot of people just couldn't make it through his books, right? I mean, they're conceptual. The prose is kind of dry. And so...
Is the prose dry?
I think the prose is dry. You don't think the prose is dry?
I love his prose.
Oh.
I totally get into it.
I go through different periods where like I will be very much into it, and then I think it's just sort of overly... I have to be careful because he's obviously one of my favorite authors, but it's pretty strict, right? And he lets up every once in a while. I'm like very appreciative of it, and sometimes it's just, here are these things that are going down, and it all has a major conceptual arc that's very important. But sometimes from like individual senses, it's just, it's not as beautiful. But it does have a greater meaning that is in itself beautiful. But from a sentence standpoint, sometimes I'm kind of ready for him to get a little romantic again.
Yeah, I think the only time that I felt that way was on Glass Bead Game.
Glass Bead Game is super dry.
He gets like super dry and conceptual, and he's laying out a very big idea that it's kind of hard to follow sometimes.
Yeah.
But I thought some of the sentences in some of his structure in Klingsor's Last Summer was
yeah, no, this is definitely, I think, one of his more passionate things. And I think even like, so I recently read Narcissus and Goldman, which as, a 19-year-old, I think I had, taken a run at. And I was amazed that after sort of getting within that novel, which I had previously thought of as being very dry and whatnot, that just so drawn to the individual characters and what they meant at a conceptual level, that it actually sort of starts to free up some of the prose. So I think, in a weird way, getting into the prose is sometimes prefaced by fully, enveloping yourself in the actual concept and trajectory itself.
Maybe that's my deal.
It's also a translation aspect, right? I'm always reading these like shitty 60-year-old paperbacks that I buy for $1 that are probably like the first translation, and
That's an interesting note, actually. These paperbacks are so prevalent of Hesse.
Yeah.
I have the whole collection.
Yeah.
I bought it all in one go at a Dallas used bookstore. Have they been reprinted, or why did they all come out at the same time? Do you have any idea?
I'm looking at mine now. I mean, I think this is from the 60s. Let me see if I can get a copyright. But yeah, I think it was people sort of, unfortunately, there is a capitalistic aspect to everything. I think it was cashing in on his prevalence in that era, and sort of when he was adopted or sort of re-brought in by, the 60s U.S. scene. So yeah, so this one's telling me, I think it's like late 60s. 68, and then maybe translation copyright 1970. So I think at some point people were like, yo, we can sell this shit. People bought Steppenwolf. Let's print them all. Let's print them all.
What else do we need to talk about in this short story?
That's a good point.
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and all around Hesse. Hopefully that's interesting to you guys.
Do you buy it? Do you believe that this is sort of Hesse's intricate portrait of an artist, or do you think? I think there's actually sort of a little bit of playful making fun of himself in it.
I take Hesse totally seriously. I don't know. He just seems so earnest in his explorations that I have a hard time seeing humor. But I mean, we've talked about this before. I have a hard time reading humor anyway.
This is true. Yeah,
you're
humor blind.
Master and Margarita, and I didn't even chuckle.
But so I read there was Thomas Mann's sort of interpretation of Glass Bead Game, and again we'll get into this in the subsequent podcast. But his point, and also being a heavily symbolic, German author of the same era, his point back to Hesse was that people are going to misunderstand this, that they're not going to see how much you were playing around, that the humor built into this. Because I think Hesse uses a lot of names that are a little playful, that they're almost, I think of it like Thomas Pynchon, who like always just has character names that are just like nouns slapped together that is exactly what the person is. And I think Hesse does do that a lot. And so he's sort of making fun at the intellectual component of it, because maybe that's what people are expecting him to do. So he just does it blatantly. And that's part of like the translation aspect is the person translating it also humor blind, and that we get like a more serious translation, or, German prose, right? I'm curious. Germans aren't necessarily, known for being the most humorous people. Their trains do run on time perfectly, though. I will say that. But
maybe Hesse is German humor.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so that's like kind of, because it is such a potentially direct self-portrait of himself. I just wonder that some of that stuff in there, is he playing into cliches on purpose? Because it is a cliche, right? It's got everything. It's got the drinking, it's got the girls, it's got the art, it's got the self-destruction. Not
only is it a cliche, there's a term for it, which I discovered.
Go on.
I'm going to butcher this because there's an umlaut. It's a Kunstlerroman.
Which is?
It means an artist's novel. It's a narrative about an artist's growth into maturity.
Okay.
It's kind of like I'm going to butcher this one too.
The Bildungsroman?
Bildungsroman? Is that how it's said?
That's how I say it in my head.
That's better than the
first time I've ever pronounced it out loud.
Yesterday was the first time I pronounced it out loud.
Dude, you're doing great.
So, the Bildungsroman, which is the kind of archetypal coming of age story.
Yeah. That's his Demian. That's the jam.
Yeah.
Sort of the German Catcher in the Rye, if you will.
He's always coming of age in some manner.
Yeah. But is this an artistic development, or is this an artistic implosion?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Is it interesting?
We need like a coin jar. Every time we say interesting, we donate to the coffee fund or something.
Deal.
Because I think there are two ways of looking at it. I see it as a coming of age story in that not only does the Klingsor, the artist, reach that apex of escaping realism and getting into pure fantasy, and I think expressing this greater truth, and he gets there by burning his candle at both ends and not relinquishing himself and his own passions for anything. And I also see it as a coming of age for Hesse himself, in that the artist dies at the end of it. But what's dying is this previous way of looking at things, this previous way of creating art, and which could not fully embrace the individual and all of the individual's spectrum, which is what his self-portrait is. And I think after this, even chronologically, Hesse really dives into that idea. He doesn't write really much of anything except what is the individual.
Yeah.
What is going on inside of a person's mind. And his, Steppenwolf pits a man against himself, Narcissus and Goldmund, pits two people against themselves, but ostensibly they represent sort of archetypes that exist within all of us. And Glass Bead Game I haven't read yet, so I can't really.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a point at which he abandoned sort of prior romantic stylings. I think that So there's a couple ways that this can like exist within the character himself, right? So the character, just from a literal standpoint, right? Maybe it's Hesse playing with the artist, but from a self-portrait standpoint, maybe it's Hesse from just a transitional moving into his new period of being an artist first and foremost. And then also just how his style related, right? So he's shifting away from sort of the romanticized stories and into just the purely conceptual. In order to do that, he has to kind of burn it down first. And so I think that's kind of where this sort of fits in the grand scheme of things.
And the story itself is it seems very romantic to me in terms of the images that he creates. And to me, it felt like, more so than his later novels, it felt like walking through a gallery of impressionist paintings or something. The way that he calls out the colors and the pink stockings against the green field and this sort of thing. And I can just very easily imagine the painting that. Well, I mean, Klingsor is a painter in the story, so I guess supposedly the painting or the drawing that he's making, but is kind of this movement through these very picturesque scenes. And he uses that method of romanticism to eventually break out of the idea of romanticism. And his final painting isn't romantic. His final painting is...
it's apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic, almost, yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think? Is this worth reading?
I mean, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot.
It's secondary, right?
If someone's new to Hesse, I don't know if I would point them directly here. I would say, he's got a great number of great works. Steppenwolf or Siddhartha would probably be a good starting point, or maybe Demian or Narcissus and Goldmund. I think that this is interesting, like with a lot of the shorts, this is interesting to see the artist's development and his, maybe when where he started to play with this idea. But yeah, I don't know. I think I would say read it, but it's not. I'm not like rush out and buy this.
It's not quintessential.
It's not quintessential.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly kind of my impression too. But I also am just amazed that each time I try to convince myself what era of Hesse I'm most into, I then just read one from a different era. So he's kind of got, I guess, maybe three-ish.
You might say 3 periods?
3 periods, if you will. And then, like, just doing some kind of...
Here we are 100 years later.
Exactly. Just throwing him right under a fucking locomotive.
Throwing him under the locomotive.
Yeah. But I always am appreciative of, just from an author standpoint, that he's probably on what I think is a very short list of somebody who their entire career just produced extremely high-quality stuff that was also different the entire time, right? He didn't just write 20 of the exact same books. Like, he really pushed himself in different ways and explored different things. And whether or not, like, his prose sort of shifts a little bit, some of it's drier than others, some of it's more romantic, whether it's, just more direct coming-of-age novels versus sort of conceptual explorations. He's just has a different range of stuff. And I think whenever you have something that's special, that's where, like, these shorter works in sort of important transitional times do have a lot of weight. It's probably, like anything, maybe the 9th thing by Hesse that you should read. But, I think there's actually, given the prevalence of these handy-dandy 1970 paperbacks, there's a lot of people who have been digging into this stuff for a while. And even though it's not really ever pop fiction, I think it did have an amazingly wide audience for, as introspective and deep as it is.
And I would add also, there's 2 other stories in this collection, and they're both also...
You read these 2?
Excellent, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so did I.
Yeah.
So the stories are, was it Child's Heart and then Klein and Wagner? And I actually...
Wagner?
Wagner? Did I just expose my Midwesternness? I pronounce everything like it's from Michigan. Yeah. But yeah, no, I think there's a reason why these are grouped together, because they also fit into this sort of, especially the second story, right?
Yeah.
And he's a character who's literally leaving his old life behind, his embezzled money, and then it's just sort of very, nihilistic and like suicidal, but he's still trying to pursue things and the senses and like just going after this new life, but it's kind of traumatizing to him, and he's battling between two halves of himself. And I just view this small collection as just that moment for Hesse.
Yeah, if you come across it, Klingsor's Last Summer, snatch it up.
It's probably going to be 99 cents to $2. Mine was $1.99.
Plus shipping?
Probably not. Shipping. Buy it from your bookstores. Otherwise, they won't exist.
I can't because B.O.S. bought them all out.
That's true. We actually have a media empire. It's not true at all. So, thanks everybody for listening. Check us out next time for our longer length podcast on. Maybe this one's already kind of long.
This might be longer.
Who knows? Have we been talking for 4 hours?
We've been talking for a little while.
That's true. We drank a lot of coffee. So check us out next time when we dive into the Glass Bead Game, which is Hesse's last work, and it's this massive sort of utopian fantasy philosophical world that he's building up, and I think it's going to be amazing to dive into. Feel free to follow us online. You can find us at booksofsomesubstance.com, our Twitter handle, BooksOSubstance, and on Facebook under Books of Some Substance, of course.
And now you can buy the artwork for each of the books that we produce on our website. So check that out too. We have a new shop open.
It is indeed open. And it's new. It's kind of new.
Newish.
Yeah. Ish.
New stuff every few months.
Like, just keep your face in there.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I lose track of where I am.